Section 2 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 2. The Capture of Panama. The Capture of Panama, 1671 and 2. John Esquemeling. Captain Morgan set forth from the castle of Chagre towards Panama, August 18, 1870. He had with him 1,200 men, 5 boats laden with auxiliary, and 32 canoes. The first day they sailed only 6 leagues, and came to a place called De los Bracos. Here a party of his men went ashore, only to sleep and stretch their limbs, being almost crippled with lying too much crowded in the boats. Having rested a while, they went abroad to seek victuals in the neighboring plantations, but they could find none, the Spaniards being fled, and carrying with them all they had. This day, being the first of their journey, they had such scarcity of victuals, as the greatest part were forced to pass with only a pipe of tobacco, without any other refreshment. Next day, about evening, they came to a place called Cruz de Juan Gallego. Here they were compelled to leave their boats and canoes, the river being very dry for want of rain, and many trees having fallen into it. The guides told them that, about 2 leagues farther, the country would be very good to continue the journey by land. Hereupon they left 160 men on board the boats to defend them, that they might serve for a refuge in necessity. Next morning, being the 3rd day, they all went ashore, except those who were able to keep the boats. To these Captain Morgan gave order, under great penalties, that no man, on any pretext whatever, should dare to leave the boats and go ashore, fearing lest they should be surprised by an ambuscade of Spaniards in the neighboring woods, which appeared so thick as to seem almost impenetrable. This morning, beginning their march, the ways proved so bad that Captain Morgan thought it more convenient to transport some of the men in canoes, though with great labor, to a place farther up the river called Cedro Bueno. Thus they re-embarked, and the canoes returned for the rest, so that about night they got all together at the said place. The pirates much desired to meet some Spaniards or Indians, hoping to fill their bellies with their provisions, being reduced to extremity and hunger. The 4th day the greatest part of the pirates marched by land, being led by one of the guides. The rest went by water farther up, being conducted by another guide, who always went before them, to discover, on both sides of the river, the ambuscades. These had also spies, who were very dexterous to give notice of all accidents, or of the arrival of the pirates, 6 hours at least before they came. This day, about noon, they came near a post called Tornacavallos. Here the guide of the canoes cried out that he perceived an ambuscade. His voice caused infinite joy to all the pirates, hoping to find some provisions to satiate their extreme hunger. Being come to the place, they found nobody in it, the Spaniards being fled, and leaving nothing behind but a few leathern bags, all empty, and a few crumbs of bread scattered on the ground where they had eaten. Being angry at this, they pulled down a few little huts which the Spaniards had made, and fell to eating the leathern bags, to allay the ferment of their stomachs, which was now so sharp as to gnaw their very bowels. Thus they made a huge banquet upon these bags of leather, divers quarrels arising concerning the greatest shares. By the bigness of the place, they conjectured about 500 Spaniards had been there, whom, finding no victuals, they were now infinitely desirous to meet, intending to devour some of them rather than perish. Having feasted themselves on these pieces of leather, they marched on, till they came about night to another post, called Torna Muni. Here they found another ambuscade, but as barren as the former. They searched the neighboring woods, but could not find anything to eat, the Spaniards having been so provident as not to leave anywhere the least crumb of subsistence, whereby the pirates were now brought to this extremity. Here again he was happy that he had reserved since noon any bit of leather to make his supper of, drinking after it a good draught of water for his comfort. Some who were never out of their mothers' kitchens may ask how these pirates could eat and digest those pieces of leather, so hard and dry. Whom I answer that, could they once experiment what hunger, or rather famine, is, they would find the way as the pirates did. For these first sliced it in pieces, then they beat it between two stones and rubbed it, often dipping it in water to make it supple and tender. Lastly, they scraped off the hair and broiled it. Thus being cooked, they cut it into small morsels and ate it, helping it down with frequent gulps of water, which by good fortune they had at hand. The fifth day, about noon, they came to a place called Barbacoa. Here they found traces of another ambuscade, but the place totally as unprovided as the former. At a small distance were several plantations, which they searched very narrowly, but could not find any person, animal, or other thing to relieve their extreme hunger. Finally, having ranged about and searched a long time, they found a grot, which seemed to be but lately hewn out of a rock, where were 2 sacks of meal, wheat, and like things, with 2 great jars of wine, and certain fruits called plantainoes. Captain Morgan, knowing some of his men were now almost dead with hunger, and fearing the same of the rest, caused what was found to be distributed among them who were in greatest necessity. Having refreshed themselves with these victuals, they marched anew with greater courage than ever. Such as were weak were put into the canoes, and those commanded to land that were in them before. Thus they prosecuted their journey till late at night, when, coming to a plantation, they took up their rest, but without eating anything, for the Spaniards as before had swept away all manner of provisions. The 6th day they continued their march, part by land and part by water. Howbeit they were constrained to rest very frequently, for both the ruggedness of the way and their extreme weakness, which they endeavored to relieve by eating leaves of trees and green herbs or grass. Such was their miserable condition. This day at noon they arrived at a plantation, where was a barn full of maize. Immediately they beat down the doors and ate it dry, as much as they could devour. Then they distributed a great quantity, giving every man a good allowance. Thus provided, and prosecuting their journey for about an hour, they came to another ambuscade. This they no sooner discovered, but they threw away their maize, with the sudden hopes of finding all things in abundance. But they were much deceived, meeting neither Indians nor victuals, nor anything else. But they saw on the other side of the river about 100 Indians, who, all fleeing, escaped. Some pirates leaped into the river to cross it, and to try to take any of the Indians, but in vain, for being much more nimble than the pirates, they not only baffled them, but killed 2 or 3 with their arrows, hooting at them and crying, "Ha, perros! A la savana! A la savana! Hey, ye dogs, go to the plain! Go to the plain!" This day they could advance no farther, being necessitated to pass the river, to continue their march on the other side. Hereupon they reposed for that night, though their sleep was not profound, for great murmurings were made at Captain Morgan and his conduct, some being desirous to return home, while others would rather die than go back a step from their undertaking. Others who had great courage laughed and joked at their discourse. Meanwhile they had a guide who much comforted them, saying, it would not now be long before they met with people, for whom they should reap some considerable advantage. The 7th day, in the morning, they made clean their arms, and every one discharged his pistol or musket, without bullet, to try their firelocks. This done, they crossed the river, leaving the post where they rested, called Santa Cruz, and at noon they arrived at a village called Cruz. Being yet far from the place, they perceived much smoke from the chimneys. The sight hereof gave them great joy, and hopes of finding people and plenty of good cheer. Thus they went on as fast as they could, encouraging one another, saying, "There is smoke comes out of every house. They are making good fires to roast and boil what we are to eat," and the like. At length they arrived there, all sweating and panting, but found no person in the town, nor anything eatable to refresh themselves, except good fires, which they wanted not, for the Spaniards before their departure had every one set fire to his own house, except the king's storehouses and stables. They had not left behind them any beast, alive or dead, which much troubled their pursuers, not finding anything but a few cats and dogs, which they immediately killed and devoured. At last, in the king's stables, they found, by good fortune, 15 or 16 jars of Peru wine, and a leathern sack full of bread. No sooner had they drunk of this wine, when they fell sick, almost every man. This made them think the wine was poisoned, which caused a new consternation in the whole camp, judging themselves now to be irrecoverably lost. But the true reason was their want of subsistence, and the manifold sorts of trash they had eaten. Their sickness was so great as caused them to remain there till the next morning, without being able to prosecute their journey in the afternoon. This village is seated in 9 degrees 2 minutes north latitude, distance from the river Chagre, 26 Spanish leagues, and 8 from Panama. This is the last place to which boats or canoes can come, for which reason they built here storehouses for all sorts of merchandise, which to and from Panama are transported on the backs of mules. Here Captain Morgan was forced to leave his canoes and land all his men, though never so weak, but lest the canoes should be surprised or take up too many men for their defense, he sent them all back to the place where the boats were, except one, which he hid, that it might serve to carry intelligence. Many of the Spaniards and Indians of this village having fled to the near plantations, Captain Morgan ordered that none should go out of the village except companies of 100 together, fearing lest the enemy should take an advantage upon his men. Notwithstanding, one party contravened these orders, being tempted with the desire of victuals, but they were soon glad to fly into the town again, being assaulted with great fury by some Spaniards and Indians, who carried one of them away prisoner. Thus the vigilancy and care of Captain Morgan was not sufficient to prevent every accident. The 8th day, in the morning, Captain Morgan sent 200 men before the body of his army, to discover the way to Panama, and any ambuscades therein, the path being so narrow that only 10 or 12 persons could march abreast, and often not so many. After 10 hours' march they came to a place called Quebrada Obscura. Here, all of a sudden, 3 or 4 thousand arrows were shot at them, they not perceiving whence they came, or who shot them, though they presumed it was from a high rocky mountain, from one side to the other, whereupon was a grot, capable of but one horse or other beast laden. This multitude of arrows much alarmed the pirates, especially because they could not discover whence they were discharged. At last, seeing no more arrows, they marched a little farther, and entered a wood. Here they perceived some Indians to fly as fast as they could, to take advantage of another post, thence to observe their march. Yet there remained one troop of Indians on the place, resolved to fight and defend themselves, which they did with great courage, till their captain fell down wounded, who, though he despaired of life, yet his valor being greater than his strength, would ask no quarter, but endeavoring to raise himself with undaunted mind, laid hold of his azagayo, or javelin, and struck it at one of the pirates, but before he could second the blow, he was shot to death. This was also the fate of many of his companions, who, like good soldiers, lost their lives with their captain for the defense of their country. The pirates endeavored to take some of the Indians prisoners, but they being swifter than the pirates, every one escaped, leaving 8 pirates dead and 10 wounded. Yea, had the Indians been more dexterous in military affairs, they might have defended the passage, and not let one man pass. A little while after they came to a large campaign, open and full of fine meadows. Hence they could perceive at a distance before them some Indians, on the top of a mountain, near the way by which they were to pass. They sent 50 men, the nimblest they had, to try to catch any of them, and force them to discover their companions, but all in vain, for they escaped by their nimbleness, and presently showed themselves in another place, hollowing to the English, and crying, a la savana, perros ingleses, that is, to the plain, To the plain, ye English dogs." Meanwhile the 10 pirates that were wounded were dressed and plastered up. Here was a wood, and on each side a mountain. The Indians possessed themselves of one, and the pirates of the other. Captain Morgan was persuaded the Spaniards had placed an ambuscade there, it lying so conveniently. Hereupon he sent 200 men to search it. The Spaniards and Indians, perceiving the pirates descended the mountain, did so too, as if they designed to attack them, but being got into the wood, out of sight of the pirates, they were seen no more, leaving the passage open. About night fell a great rain, which caused the pirates to march the faster, and seek for houses to preserve their arms from being wet. But the Indians had set fire to every one, and driven away all their cattle, that the pirates, finding neither houses nor victuals, might be constrained to return. But after diligent search they found a few shepherds' huts, but in them nothing to eat. These not holding many men, they placed in them out of every company a small number, who kept the arms of the rest. Those who remained in the open field endured much hardship that night, the rain not ceasing till morning. Next morning, about the break of day, being the 9th of that tedious journey, Captain Morgan marched on while the fresh air of the morning lasted, for the clouds hanging yet over their heads were much more favorable than the scorching rays of the sun, the way being now more difficult than before. After 2 hours' march they discovered about 20 Spaniards, who observed their motions. They endeavored to catch some of them, but could not, they suddenly disappearing and absconding themselves in caves among the rocks unknown to the pirates. At last, ascending a high mountain, they discovered the South Sea. This happy sight, as it were the end of their labors, caused infinite joy among them. Hence they could descry also one ship and 6 boats, which were set forth from Panama, and sailed towards the isles of Tavaga and Tavogia. Then they came to a vale, where they found much cattle, whereof they killed good store. Here, while some killed and flayed cows, horses, bulls, and chiefly asses, of whom there were most, others kindled fires, and got wood to roast them. Then, cutting the flesh into convenient pieces, or gobbets, they threw them into the fire, and half carbonated, or roasted, they devoured them with incredible haste and appetite. Such was their hunger, that they more resembled cannibals than Europeans, the blood many times running down their beards to their waists. Having satisfied their hunger, Captain Morgan then continued the march. Here again he sent before the main body 50 men to take some prisoners, if they could, for he was much more concerned that in 9 days he could not meet one person to inform him of the condition and forces of the Spaniards. About evening they discovered about 200 Spaniards, who hallooed to the pirates, but they understood not what they said. A little while after they came in sight of the highest steeple of Panama. This they no sooner discovered, but they showed signs of extreme joy, casting up their hats into the air, leaping and shouting, just as if they had already obtained the victory and accomplished their designs. All their trumpets sounded and drums beat, in token of this alacrity of their minds. Thus they pitched their camp for that night, with general content of the whole army, waiting with impatience for the morning, when they intended to attack the city. This evening appeared 50 horses, who came out of the city, on the noise of the drums and trumpets, to observe, as it was thought, their motions. They came almost within musket shot of the army, with a trumpet that sounded marvelously well. Those on horseback hallooed aloud to the pirates, and threatened them, saying, "Perros, nos veremos," that is, "Ye dogs, we shall meet ye." Having made this menace, they returned to the city, except only 7 or 8 horsemen, who hovered thereabouts to watch their motions. Immediately after the city fired, and ceased not to play their biggest guns all night loud against the camp, but with little or no harm to the pirates, whom they could not easily reach. Now also the 200 Spaniards, whom the pirates had seen in the afternoon, appeared again, making a show of blocking up the passages, that no pirates might escape their hands. But the pirates, though in a manner besieged, instead of fearing their blockades, as soon as they had placed sentinels about their camp, opened their satchels, and, without any napkins or plates, fell to eating, very heartily, the pieces of bulls and horses' flesh which they had reserved since noon. This done, they laid themselves down to sleep on the grass, with great repose and satisfaction, expecting only with impatience the dawning of the next day. The 10th day, betimes in the morning, they put all their men in order, and with drums and trumpets sounding, marched directly towards the city. But one of the guides desired Captain Morgan not to take the common highway, lest they should find in it many ambuscades. He took his advice, and chose another way through the wood, though very irksome and difficult. The Spaniards, perceiving the pirates had taken another way they scarce had thought on, were compelled to leave their stops and batteries, and to come out to meet them. The governor of Panama put his forces in order, consisting of 2 squadrons, 4 regiments of foot, and a huge number of wild bulls, which were driven by a great number of Indians, with some negroes, and others to help them. The pirates, now upon their march, came to the top of a little hill, whence they had a large prospect of the city and campaign country underneath. Here they discovered the forces of the people of Panama, in battle array, to be so numerous that they were surprised with fear, much doubting the fortune of the day. Yea, few or none there were but wished themselves at home, or at least free from obligation of that engagement, it so nearly concerning their lives. Having been some time wavering in their minds, they at last reflected on the straits they had brought themselves into, and that now they must either fight resolutely or die, for no quarter could be expected from an enemy on whom they had committed so many cruelties. Hereupon they encouraged one another, resolving to conquer, or to spend the last drop of blood. Then they divided themselves into 3 battalions, sending before 200 buccaneers, who were very dexterous at their guns. Then, descending the hill, they marched directly towards the Spaniards, who, in a spacious field, waited their coming. As soon as they drew nigh, the Spaniards began to shout and cry, "Viva el Rey!" God save the king, and immediately their horse moved against the pirates, but the fields being full of quags and soft underfoot, they could not wheel about as they desired. The 200 buccaneers who went before, each putting one knee to the ground, began to battle briskly, with a full volley of shot. The Spaniards defended themselves courageously, doing all they could to disorder the pirates. Their foot endeavored to second the horse, but were forced by the fire of the pirates to retreat. Finding themselves baffled, they attempted to drive the bulls against them behind, to put them into disorder, but the wild cattle ran away, frightened with the noise of the battle. Only some few broke through the English companies, and only tore the colors in pieces, while the buccaneers shot nearly every one of them dead. The battle having continued 2 hours, the greatest part of the Spanish horse was ruined, while the buccaneers shot every one of them dead. The battle having continued 2 hours, the greatest part of the Spanish horse was ruined, and almost all killed, the rest fled, which the foot seeing, and that they could not possibly prevail, they discharged the shot they had in their muskets, and throwing them down, fled away, every one as he could. The pirates could not follow them, being too much harassed and wearied with their long journey. Many, not being able to fly whither they desired, hid themselves, for that present, among the shrubs of the seaside, but very unfortunately, for most of them being found by the pirates, were instantly killed, without any quarter. Some religious men were brought prisoners before Captain Morgan, but he, being deaf to their cries, commanded them all to be pistoled, which was done. Soon after they brought a captain to him, whom he examined very strictly, particularly wherein consisted the forces of those of Panama. He answered, their whole strength consisted in 400 horse, 24 companies of foot, each 100 men complete, 60 Indians, and some negroes, who were to drive 2,000 wild bulls upon the English, and thus by breaking their files put them into total disorder. Besides, that in the city they had made some trenches, and raised batteries in several places, in all which they had placed many guns, and at that entry of the highway leading to the city they had built a fort, mounted with 8 great brass guns, defended by 50 men. Captain Morgan, having heard this, gave orders instantly to march another way, but first he made a review of his men, whereof he found both killed and wounded a considerable number, and much greater than had been believed. Of the Spaniards were found 600 dead on the place, besides the wounded and prisoners. The pirates, nothing discouraged, seeing their numbers so diminished, but rather filled with greater pride, perceiving what huge advantage they had obtained against their enemies, having rested some time, prepared to march courageously towards the city, plighting their oaths to one another that they would fight till not a man was left alive. With this courage they recommenced their march, either to conquer or to be conquered, carrying with them all the prisoners. They found much difficulty in their approach to the city, for within the town the Spaniards had placed many great guns, at several quarters, some charged with small pieces of iron, others with musket bullets. With these they saluted the pirates at their approaching, and gave them full and frequent broadsides, firing at them incessantly, so that unavoidably they lost at every step great numbers of men. But not these manifest dangers of their lives, nor the sight of so many as dropped continually at their sides, could deter them from advancing and gaining ground every moment on the enemy, and though the Spaniards never ceased to fire and act the best they could for their defense, yet they were forced to yield after 3 hours' combat, and the pirates, having possessed themselves at last of the city, killed all that attempted in the least to oppose them. The inhabitants had transported the best of their goods to more remote and secret places. Howbeit they found in the city several warehouses well stocked with merchandise, as well silks and cloths, as linen and other things of value. As soon as the first fury of their entrance was over, Captain Morgan assembled his men, and commanded them, under great penalties, not to drink or taste any wine, and the reason he gave for it was this: because he had intelligence that it was all poisoned by the Spaniards. Howbeit it was thought he gave these prudent orders to prevent the debauchery of his people, which he foresaw would be very great at the first, after so much hunger sustained by the way, fearing withal lest the Spaniards, seeing them in wine, should rally, and, falling on the city, use them as humanely as they had used the inhabitants before. Captain Morgan, as soon as he had placed necessary guards at several quarters within and without the city, commanded 25 men to seize a great boat, which had struck in the mud of the port, for want of water, at a low tide. The same day, about noon, he caused fire privately to be set to several great edifices of the city, nobody knowing who were the authors thereof, much less of what motives Captain Morgan did it, which are unknown to this day. The fire increased so that before the night the greatest part of the city was in a flame. Captain Morgan pretended the Spaniards had done it, perceiving that his own people reflected on him for that action. Many of the Spaniards, and some of the pirates, did what they could, either to quench the flames, or by blowing up houses with gunpowder, and pulling down others to stop it, but in vain, for in less than half an hour it consumed a whole street. All the houses of the city were built with cedar, very curious and magnificent, and richly adorned, especially with hangings and paintings, whereof part were before removed, but another great part were consumed by fire. There were in this city, which is the see of a bishop, 8 monasteries, 7 for men and 1 for women, 2 stately churches, and 1 hospital. The churches and monasteries were all richly adorned with altarpieces and paintings, much gold and silver and other precious things, all which the ecclesiastics had hidden, besides which here were 2,000 houses of magnificent building, the greatest part inhabited by merchants vastly rich. For the rest of less quality and tradesmen, this city contained 5,000 more. Here were also many stables for the horses and mules that carry the plate of the King of Spain, as well as of private men, towards the North Sea. The neighboring fields were full of fertile plantations and pleasant gardens, affording delicious prospects to the inhabitants all of the year. The Genoese had in this city a stately house for their trade of negroes, This likewise was by Captain Morgan burnt to the very ground. Besides which building, there were consumed 200 warehouses and many slaves, who had hid themselves therein with innumerable sacks of meal, the fire of which continued 4 weeks after it had begun. The greatest part of the pirates still encamped without the city, fearing and expecting the Spaniards could come and fight them anew, it being known they much outnumbered the pirates. This made them keep the field, to preserve their forces united, now much diminished by their losses. Their wounded, which were many, they put into one church, which remained standing, the rest being consumed by the fire. Besides these decrees of his men, Captain Morgan had sent a convoy of 150 men to the castle of Chagre, to carry the news of his victory at Panama. They saw often whole troops of Spaniards run to and fro in the fields, which made them suspect their rallying, which they never had the courage to do. In the afternoon Captain Morgan re-entered the city with his troops, that every one might take up their lodgings, which now they could hardly find, few houses being escaped the fire. Then they sought very carefully among the ruins and ashes for utensils of plate or gold, that were not quite wasted by the flames, and of such they found no small number, especially in wells and cisterns where the Spaniards had hid them. Next day Captain Morgan dispatched away 2 troops of 150 men each, stout and well armed, to seek for the inhabitants who were escaped. These, having made several excursions up and down the fields, woods, and mountains adjacent, returned after 2 days, and bringing above 200 prisoners, men, women, and slaves. The next day returned also the boat which Captain Morgan had sent to the South Sea, bringing 3 other boats which they had taken. But all these pirates they could willingly have given, and greater labor into the bargain, for 1 galleon, which miraculously escaped, richly laden with the king's plate, jewels, and other precious goods of the best and richest merchants of Panama, on board which were also the religious women of the nunnery, who had embarked with them all the ornaments of their church, consisting of much gold, plate, and other things of value. The strength of this galleon was inconsiderable, having only 7 guns and 10 or 12 muskets, and very ill provided with victuals, necessaries, and fresh water, having no more sails than the uppermost of the mast. This account the pirates received from someone who had spoken with 7 mariners belonging to the galleon, who came ashore in the cockboat for fresh water. Hence they concluded they might easily have taken it, had they given her chase, as they should have done, but they were impeded from following this vastly rich prize by their gluttony and drunkenness, having plentifully debauched themselves with several rich wines they had found ready, choosing rather to satiate their appetites than to lay hold on such huge advantage, since this one prize would have been of far greater value than all they got at Panama and the places thereabout. Next day, repenting of their negligence, being weary of their vices and debaucheries, they set forth another boat, well armed, to pursue with all speed the said galleon, but in vain, the Spaniards who were on board having had intelligence of their own danger 1 or 2 days before, while the pirates were cruising so near them, whereupon they fled to places more remote and unknown. The pirates found, in the ports of the islands of Tavoga and Togavilla, several boats laden with very good merchandise, all of which they took and brought to Panama, where they made an exact relation of all they had passed to Captain Morgan. The prisoners confirmed what the pirates said, adding that they undoubtedly knew where the galleon might then be, but that it was very probable that they had been relieved before now from other places. This stirred up Captain Morgan anew to send forth all the boats in the port of Panama to seek the said galleon till they could find her. These boats, being in all 4, after 8 days cruising to and fro, and searching several ports and creeks, lost all hope of finding her, whereupon they returned to Tavoga and Togavilla. Here they found a reasonable good ship, newly come from Paita, laden with cloth, soap, sugar, and biscuit, with 20,000 pieces of each. This they instantly seized, without the least resistance, as also a boat which was not far off, on which they laid great part of the merchandise from the ship, with some slaves. With this spoil they returned to Panama, somewhat better satisfied, yet withal much discontented that they could not meet with the galleon. The convoy which Captain Morgan had sent to the castle of Chagre returned much about the same time, bringing with them very good news, for while Captain Morgan was on his journey to Panama, those he had left in the castle of Chagre had sent for 2 boats to cruise. These met with a Spanish ship, which they chased within sight of the castle. This being perceived by the pirates in the castle, they put forth Spanish colors to deceive the ship that fled before the boats, and the poor Spaniards, thinking to take refuge under the castle, were caught in a snare and made prisoner. The cargo on board the said vessel consisted in victuals and provisions, than which nothing could be more opportune for the castle, where they had already begun to want things of this kind. This good luck of those of Chagre caused Captain Morgan to stay longer at Panama, ordering several new excursions into the country round about, and while the pirates at Panama were upon these expeditions, those at Chagre were busy in piracies on the North Sea. Captain Morgan sent forth daily parties of 200 men to make inroads into all the country round about, and when one party came back another went forth, who soon gathered much riches and many prisoners. These being brought into the city were put into the most exquisite tortures, to make them confess both other people's goods and their own. Here it happened that one poor wretch was found in the house of a person of quality, who had put on, amidst the confusion, a pair of taffety breeches of his master's, with a little silver key hanging out; perceiving which, they asked him for the cabinet of the said key. His answer was, he knew not what was become of it, but that finding those breeches in his master's house, he had made bold to wear them. Not being able to get any other answer, they put him on the rack, and inhumanly disjointed his arms. Then they twisted a cord about his forehead, which they wrung so hard that his eyes appeared as big as eggs, and were ready to fall out. But with these torments, not obtaining any positive answer, they hung him up by the wrists, giving him many blows and stripes under that intolerable pain and posture of body. Afterwards they cut off his nose and ears, and singed his face with burning straw, till he could not speak, nor lament his misery any longer. Then, losing all hopes of any confession, they bade a negro to run him through, which put an end to his life, and to their inhuman tortures. Thus did many others of those miserable prisoners finish their days, the common sport and recreation of these pirates being such tragedies. Captain Morgan, having now been at Panama full 3 weeks, commanded all things to be prepared for his departure. He ordered every company of men to seek so many beasts of carriage as might convey the spoil to the river where his canoes lay. About this time there was a great rumor that a considerable number of pirates intended to leave Captain Morgan, and that, taking a ship then in port, they determined to go and rob on the South Sea, till they had as much as they thought fit, and then return homewards by way of the East Indies; for which purpose they had gathered much provisions, which they had hid in private places, with sufficient powder, bullets, and all other ammunition; likewise some great guns belonging to the town, muskets, and other things, wherewith they designed not only to equip their vessel, but to fortify themselves in some island which might serve them for a place of refuge. This design had certainly taken effect, had not Captain Morgan had timely advice of it from one of their comrades. Hereupon he commanded the mainmast of the said ship to be cut down and burnt, with all the other boats in the port. Hereby the intentions of all or most of his companions were totally frustrated. Then Captain Morgan sent many of the Spaniards into the adjoining fields and country to seek for money, to ransom not only themselves but the rest of the prisoners, as likewise the ecclesiastics. Moreover, he commanded all the artillery of the town to be nailed and stopped up. At the same time he sent out a strong company of men to seek for the governor of Panama, of whom intelligence was brought that he had laid several ambuscades in the way by which he ought to return; but they returned soon after, saying that they had not found any sign of such ambuscades; for confirmation whereof they brought some prisoners, who declared that the said governor had had an intention of making some opposition by the way, but that the men designed to effect it were unwilling to undertake it, so that for want of means he could not put his designs in execution. February 24th, 1671, Captain Morgan departed from Panama, or rather from the place where the city of Panama stood, of the spoils whereof he carried with him 175 beasts of carriage, laden with silver, gold, and other precious things, besides about 600 prisoners, men, women, children, and slaves. That day they came to a river that passes through a delicious plain, a league from Panama. Here Captain Morgan put all his forces into good order, so that the prisoners were in the middle, surrounded on all sides with pirates, where nothing else was to be heard but lamentations, cries, shrieks, and doleful sighs of so many women and children, who feared Captain Morgan designed to transport them all into his own country for slaves. Besides, all those miserable prisoners endured extreme hunger and thirst at that time, which misery Captain Morgan designedly caused them to sustain, to excite them to seek for money to ransom themselves according to the tax he had set upon every one. Many of the women begged Captain Morgan on their knees, with infinite sighs and tears, to let them return to Panama, there to live with their dead husbands and children in little huts of straw, which they would erect, seeing that they had no houses till the rebuilding of the city. But his answer was, "Ye came not thither to hear lamentations and cries, but to seek money. Therefore they ought first to seek out that, wherever it was to be had, and to bring it to him. Otherwise he would assuredly transport them all to such places whither they cared not to go." Next day, when the march began, those lamentable cries and shrieks were renewed, so as it would have caused compassion in the hardest heart. But Captain Morgan, as a man little given to mercy, was not moved in the least. They marched in the same order as before, one party of the pirates in the van, the prisoners in the middle, and the rest of the pirates in the rear, by which the miserable Spaniards were at every step punched and thrust in their backs and sides with the blunt ends of their arms to make them march faster. A beautiful lady, wife to one of the richest merchants of Tavoga, was led prisoner by herself between two pirates. Her lamentations pierced the skies, seeing herself carried away into captivity, often crying to the pirates and telling them that she had given orders to two religious persons, in whom she had relied, to go to a certain place and fetch so much money as her ransom did amount to; that they had promised faithfully to do it, but having obtained the money, instead of bringing it to her, they had employed it in another way, to ransom some of their own and particular friends. This ill action of theirs was discovered by a slave, who brought a letter to the said lady. Her complaints, and the cause thereof, having brought it to Captain Morgan, he thought fit to inquire thereinto. Having found it to be true, especially hearing it confirmed by the confession of the said religious men, though under some frivolous excuses of having diverted the money but for a day or two, in which time they expected more sums to repay it, he gave liberty to the said lady, whom otherwise he designed to transport to Jamaica. But he detained the said religious men as prisoners in her place, using them according to their deserts. Captain Morgan, arriving at the town called Cruz, on the banks of the river Chagre, he published an order among the prisoners, that within 3 days every one of them should bring in their ransom, under the penalty of being transported to Jamaica. Meanwhile he gave orders for so much rice and maize to be collected thereabouts, as was necessary for victualling his ships. Here some of the prisoners were ransomed, but many others could not bring in their money. Hereupon he continued his voyage, leaving the village on the 5th of March following, carrying with him all the spoils he could. Hence he likewise led away some new prisoners, inhabitants there, with those in Panama, who had not paid their ransoms. But the 2 religious men, who had diverted the lady's money, were ransomed 3 days after by other persons, who had more compassion for them than they had shown for her. About the middle of the way to Chagre, Captain Morgan commanded them to be mustered, and caused every one to be sworn that they had concealed nothing, even not to the value of sixpence. This done, Captain Morgan, knowing those lewd fellows would not stick to swear falsely for interest, he commanded every one to be searched very strictly, both in their clothes and satchels and elsewhere. Yea, that this order might not be ill taken by his companions, he permitted himself to be searched, even to his very shoes. To this effect, by common consent, one was assigned out of every company to be the searchers of the rest. The French pirates that assisted on this expedition disliked this new practice of searching, but being outnumbered by the English, they were forced to submit as well as the rest. The search being over, they re-embarked, and arrived at the castle of Chagre on the 9th of March. Section 3